What happens when a young black man stands up against a system built to keep him down? You won't believe how his fight for justice leaves the courtroom in complete silence. The courtroom was the picture of order. Pristine white walls, rows of unforgiving chairs that seemed designed for discomfort, and an air so thick with pretense that you could almost choke on it. The judge's bench loomed like an ancient throne, above everyone else, casting a long shadow on the defendants. Every glance, every movement was observed and judged. It wasn't just a trial, it felt like a performance, where you, the defendant, were the exhibit. The system, cold and calculating, looked down on you like a lion surveying its prey. And as a black man, you were already guilty before you even opened your mouth. Jalen Dawson knew this reality all too well. He'd grown up in a world where his skin color was an automatic verdict, no matter how much he tried to play by their rules. He wasn't even a criminal. But the courtroom wasn't concerned with the truth. The truth was irrelevant. This was about a system, one that was wired to make him the villain, simply because he was black. No matter how clean his record was, no matter how much he tried to fit in, it was all irrelevant. He was here in this sterile room, not as a man fighting for his rights, but as another statistic to add to a long list of black bodies whose fates were sealed by the color of their skin. Jalen wasn't some thug off the street, wasn't some gang member that the system could chew up and spit out. He had a purpose, a life that was more than just a collection of charges and numbers. But that didn't matter. He didn't belong here. Yet here he was, sitting in the defendant's chair, dressed in a simple black hoodie, feeling like a fish caught in a net. The system had already decided what his fate was, and no amount of logic or sense could change that. The judge, the prosecutor, they were all part of this machine, a machine designed to crush him. But they were wrong. The room hummed with tension as Judge Grayson took his seat. He was high above everyone else, perched on his chair like a king on his throne, ready to pass judgment. His eyes scanned the room with the detached indifference of someone who'd seen it all and didn't care. Grayson wasn't looking at Jalen as an individual. He was looking at him as just another black man, someone who was guilty before he even stepped foot in this room. To him, this wasn't about a trial. It was about maintaining order, enforcing the status quo. Jalen was just another pawn in a game that had already been decided before it even started. Jalen Dawson, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The judge's voice rang out coldly, without emotion. It was like he was reading the weather forecast, not announcing a life-altering moment for another human being. His eyes locked with Jalen's, and there it was. That familiar glance that black men had seen 1,000 times in situations like this. The look that said, "You're guilty, and you're going to pay for it." The prosecutor, a sharply dressed man with a too-tight tie, stood and began his opening statement with practiced ease. His words were precise, carefully measured, as though he'd memorized them in front of a mirror 100 times. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence will show that the defendant was caught red-handed behind the wheel of a stolen vehicle. He tried to flee from the police and was apprehended after a high-speed chase. This is a clear-cut case of criminal behavior. Jalen wanted to laugh, or maybe scream. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't some lowlife who needed to be tossed aside. But that's how the system saw him. The judge saw him as a problem to be solved. The prosecutor saw him as an obstacle to his own promotion. And the jury, well, they were just another cog in this machine, waiting to be told what to think. They weren't even given the chance to make their own judgments. Everything had already been decided for them. Jalen leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the situation settle into his bones. His eyes flickered around the courtroom, taking in the polished wood, the cold stone floors, the faces staring at him like he was a specimen under a microscope. He could almost feel the eyes of the jury on him, the silent judgment. In this space, in this room, he was just another black man with a criminal record waiting to happen. But Jalen wasn't having it. He wasn't about to let the system swallow him whole without a fight. He wasn't about to let these people make him into something he wasn't, and this was his moment to prove it. Without warning, Jalen stood up. His movement was abrupt, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. It was like the sound of his shoes hitting the floor was a declaration. a challenge to everything they'd assumed about him. Everyone in the courtroom went silent, even the judge, who had expected Jalen to cower. Jalen didn't flinch. He wasn't intimidated by the cold marble walls or the judge's condescending glare. He was here for a reason. He was here to make sure his voice was heard. "Hold on, prosecutor," Jalen said, his voice clear, steady, and laced with a calm confidence. The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence, confused as if he hadn't expected Jalen to speak. Jalen continued, his gaze unwavering as he addressed the entire room. "You're saying I tried to flee the scene, but I've got something to say about that. I'm not the one who's running from the truth here." His eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to challenge him. "The truth is, I wasn't the one who stole that car, and I sure as hell wasn't running. And I can prove it." There was a pause. A few people in the jury shifted in their seats. Their interest peaked. The prosecutor was thrown off, clearly not expecting such defiance from someone he'd already written off as guilty. Jalen reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, calmly setting it down on the defense table. "I've got the footage," he said, his voice louder now, growing in intensity. "I've got proof that what the police said happened didn't. I wasn't running. I wasn't trying to escape. I was trying to get out of a situation that should never have happened in the first place." The entire courtroom fell silent as Jalen's words hung in the air. The prosecutor's mouth opened, but no words came out. His smug expression faltered for a split second, then quickly returned to his practiced neutrality. But Jalen had already planted the seed of doubt in the minds of everyone who had been so quick to write him off. Jalen hit play on his phone, and the courtroom watched as a video filled the screen. It showed the police officer chasing him, but there was one glaring fact that everyone in the room had missed. The officer's GPS logs showed that he wasn't even near the scene of the arrest when it happened. The officer had lied about being the one to witness Jalen in the car. The prosecutor was speechless. The judge shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. The room had been turned upside down in one move, and that was when Jalen knew he had them. He knew they wouldn't be able to explain away the truth. "Now," Jalen said, finally sitting back down, "either you start telling the truth or I walk out of here a free man. But not just me. Everyone who's ever had their rights taken from them just because of the color of their skin. You want to keep pretending that this is just another case? Or do you want to face the reality that this is about a system that's broken?" Jalen's words hit like a bombshell. The room was in shock, and for the first time, Jalen felt something that had eluded him his entire life, the power of his own voice. Judge Grayson looked down at his papers, no longer sure how to proceed. The prosecutor, who had been so confident just moments ago, was now scrambling to salvage what little dignity he had left. And Jalen? He sat back, watching it all unfold, knowing that no matter what happened next, he had already won. This wasn't just a fight for freedom. It was a fight for justice, a fight that had started long before he ever set foot in that courtroom. And no matter what the system tried to do, no matter how hard they tried to silence him, Jalen Dawson wasn't going down without a fight. And this was just the beginning. The courtroom was as still as a tomb, the kind of stillness that makes the hairs on the back of your neck rise. Every single person in the room, judge, jury, prosecutors, and even the bailiffs, was locked in, their attention completely drawn to Jalen. He stood there, not just as a defendant, but as someone ready to make a statement that would change everything. His words, his every move, were no longer about defending his life. They were about making sure that, for once, the truth wasn't going to get buried under the weight of lies and manipulation. He knew that at this very moment, he was fighting not just for his freedom, but for something bigger, something that needed to be heard. He wasn't just standing in a courtroom. He was standing on a battlefield, the war between truth and the systems that seek to bury it. And as he stood there, Jalen's mind raced, feeling the pressure of the centuries of injustice, the weight of history. He knew he had to go beyond just proving his innocence. He had to expose the entire system for what it was, an unyielding, oppressive force that operated on assumptions, on stereotypes, and on racial prejudices that stretched far deeper than any legal brief or document. He was ready to face them head on. "You're saying I tried to run? That I was in that car, right?" His voice rang out, cutting through the cold, clinical atmosphere of the courtroom. The words echoed off the stone walls like a challenge, as if he were throwing down the gauntlet to everyone who had decided what he was, before they even knew his name. His tone was calm, almost eerily calm, but beneath it simmered an intensity that was unmistakable. This wasn't just a defense. This was a battle for his life, for his dignity, and for his future. Every eye in the room locked on Jalen, some with disbelief, others with doubt. No one expected this. Certainly not the prosecutor, who had been so confident in his case, so sure that Jalen would just sit there, cowed and silent, taking whatever they threw at him. But instead, here was Jalen, standing tall, not just defying the expectations, but threatening to flip the whole courtroom on its head. "You're accusing me of fleeing the scene? You say I was in that stolen car," Jalen continued, his voice now rising just enough to make sure everyone in the room could hear him. "But I'm telling you right now, you're lying. You're flat out lying about everything." The atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, filled with an electric charge, as Jalen's words settled into the minds of everyone present. The prosecutor, a man who had practically been coasting through his closing arguments, suddenly found himself thrown off balance. His confident smirk faltered, and for a brief moment, he looked genuinely rattled. Jalen's confidence only grew, and as he spoke, he could feel the shift in the room. A subtle, undeniable change. The smug prosecutor, who had been so sure of his victory, now stood speechless. Jalen wasn't just defending himself. He was calling out the lies, unraveling the very foundation of the case that had been built on assumption and racial prejudice. "I didn't run, and I certainly wasn't in that car the way you say I was," Jalen said, his words now hitting harder with every syllable. "But you know what? I've got something that'll make you and your whole case look like a house of cards." Jalen's eyes locked with the prosecutor's. This wasn't just a verbal confrontation. It was a war of wills. And Jalen wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was showing them that the real criminal in this room wasn't him. The prosecutor was scrambling now, visibly uncomfortable, trying to cling to the narrative that he had spent days, weeks even, building. But it was crumbling before him. How could he have overlooked something so obvious? He'd painted a picture of a guilty man, a criminal on the run. But Jalen wasn't that man. And now, with the pieces falling apart, the prosecutor began to realize the truth. His case was built on lies, and the truth was about to knock it all down. "I've got the footage," Jalen said calmly, pulling out a small device from his pocket. The room was silent as Jalen connected his tablet to the courtroom screen. The screen flickered to life, and a grainy video began to play. A video of Jalen's arrest, showing clearly that he wasn't fleeing from the scene. In fact, the video showed him slowing down his car, pulling over as he was told, and even cooperating with the officers. But what really made the prosecutor's case crumble was the key detail. The officer who had allegedly witnessed Jalen in the car wasn't where he said he was. In fact, the officer's GPS logs showed that he had been nowhere near the scene of the arrest at the time he claimed. The room went cold. The prosecutor's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at the screen, his face draining of color as the video continued to play. The officer had lied about the chase, about the arrest, and about everything that had led up to it. Jalen wasn't the criminal in this story. He was the victim of a system that had already decided his guilt before the facts were even considered. Jalen sat back in his chair, watching as the prosecutor struggled to regain control. His earlier composure was gone now, replaced by frustration and confusion. The lie he'd been so confident in had been exposed for what it was, a lie. "How long did you think you could keep it hidden?" Jalen asked, his voice now filled with a quiet triumph. "You had all the power, didn't you? The badge, the authority, the truth on your side, you thought. But you've been lying to cover up your own mistakes, and I'm done letting you hide behind your lies." The words hung in the air, and the effect was immediate. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of himself just moments ago, now looked like he was the one on trial. The atmosphere in the room shifted again. The balance of power had changed, and it wasn't in the hands of the prosecutor or the judge anymore. It was in Jalen's hands. But it wasn't just the prosecutor who was reeling. Judge Grayson, who had been sitting high above them all, trying to maintain his neutral stance, now found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about this case. He had dismissed Jalen as another black man in trouble with the law, but now, with the truth staring him in the face, he had to confront the uncomfortable reality that he had been complicit in a system that had already sentenced this young man before he even walked into this room. Jalen's eyes never left the judge as he spoke again. You think you have the power to decide who's guilty and who's not, but you don't get to make that decision today, not when the truth's staring you in the face. The words were calm but forceful, and Judge Grayson felt his own authority slipping through his fingers. Jalen wasn't just challenging the case, he was challenging the very system that allowed this kind of injustice to thrive. For a long moment, there was silence, and in that silence, something significant happened. The system, which had been designed to maintain control and suppress voices like Jalen's, was beginning to crack. The lies were coming apart, and all that was left was the truth. The prosecutor had no more cards to play. The judge, though unwilling to admit it yet, knew that his hands were tied. Jalen had exposed the flaws in their case, and there was no going back. "You're free to go," Judge Grayson finally said, his voice lacking the usual authority. It was a simple statement, but it felt like the weight of the world was shifting. Jalen stood up, his back straight, his eyes proud. As he walked out of the courtroom, he knew that this was more than just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that was designed to silence them. And for the first time, Jalen felt like he wasn't just a statistic, a face in the crowd. He was a man who had reclaimed his power, his dignity, and his future. This wasn't the end of the fight. This was just the beginning. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. It wasn't the usual stillness that follows a judge's ruling or the quiet tension of an impending decision. No, this was different. This was a silence so heavy you could feel the weight of it pressing against your chest. It was the kind of silence that happens when something huge is unfolding, when history is about to shift, when the very foundation of the system is being called into question. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked on Jalen. They had all expected him to fold, to back down. After all, he was just a young black man, right? But here he was, standing tall, poised and unflinching, as if he were the one in control. And for the first time, the courtroom felt like it belonged to him. Judge Grayson, sitting high above the courtroom, was the first to break the silence, but not with his usual booming authority. Instead, he sat frozen behind his desk, his face clouded, his eyes narrowed in confusion. He had expected Jalen to be a passive participant in this trial, a statistic that would slide into the system without a fight. But Jalen had proved him wrong. Jalen had done the unthinkable. He had stood up and demanded the truth, and now the walls that had once protected the status quo were beginning to crack. The prosecutor, on the other hand, was visibly rattled. His confident demeanor was gone. There was no swagger, no practiced smirk on his face now. His jaw was tight, his hands shaking slightly as he clutched the case file. It was like watching a soldier who had been confident of his victory, only to find himself blindsided by an ambush. His carefully constructed case, the one he'd rehearsed for days, was unraveling in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The black kid he thought he could crush with one hand had turned the tables on him. Jalen had done it, and now the prosecutor was scrambling. He was on the defensive, but it was clear that his arguments had already been demolished. Every word he had spoken, every assumption he'd made about Jalen, had been proven wrong. This wasn't a case of a guilty man caught in the act. No, this was a story of systemic failure, of a legal system that had been so sure of its own righteousness that it failed to question its own bias. Jalen stayed calm. He didn't let the palpable tension around him throw him off. He had one shot at this. He knew that everything hinged on the next few moments. He wasn't just fighting for his own freedom anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or crushed under the weight of an unjust system. He wasn't just a defendant. He was a symbol. "You think I tried to run," Jalen said, his voice clear, almost quiet, but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "You think I was in that stolen car, right? You think you've got it all figured out. His words reverberated through the room, the walls absorbing them like the truth they were. He wasn't speaking just to the prosecutor anymore. He was speaking to everyone in the room, to the judge, to the jury, to the gallery, to every person who had ever been in his position and felt helpless, silenced by the system that had already made up its mind. Jalen's eyes never left the prosecutor, whose face had now gone pale. It was a look of disbelief, as if he couldn't quite wrap his head around what was happening. This wasn't supposed to be happening, but it was, and Jalen wasn't backing down. "You're lying," Jalen continued, his voice unwavering. "I didn't run. I wasn't even in that car the way you're saying." He paused, letting the words settle into the room like a heavy bomb. "And I've got the evidence to prove it." There was a moment of stunned silence. The prosecutor looked like he had just been punched in the stomach. The room held its breath. This was not the scene they had been expecting. The prosecutor had expected to walk away with an easy conviction. But now it was clear that everything he thought he knew was being torn apart. It was as if the very foundations of his case were crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of Jalen's words. Jalen reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen. "Here's the proof," he said as he connected it to the courtroom's display system. The screen flickered to life, and Jalen's voice rang out again. "If you check the GPS data, you'll see that the officer who claimed to see me behind the wheel was nowhere near the scene when it happened. He lied, and I can prove it." The tension in the courtroom went up another notch. Everyone, from the judge to the prosecutor, was glued to the screen now. The officer's location didn't match up with the timeline of the arrest. The whole case was built on a lie that was now exposed right there for everyone to see. The prosecutor stammered, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The evidence was out. The foundation of his entire case had been swept away in a matter of seconds, and there was no way to rebuild it. Jalen sat back down, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He had just taken control of the courtroom, and he knew it. The judge, who had been so sure that Jalen was just another black defendant who would be found guilty without a second thought, was now visibly rattled. His usual air of superiority had all but evaporated. "Your Honor," Jalen said, turning to Judge Grayson, his tone now carrying the weight of someone who had just won the battle, but knew the war was far from over. "You accused me of trying to flee, but if I was running, why would I slow down and pull over? You've got the footage. You've got the data. So what's the excuse now?" Judge Grayson's fingers drummed nervously against the desk. He looked down at the evidence before him, but this time there was no escaping the truth. This wasn't just a legal battle for Jalen. It was a battle that exposed the ugly truth about how the system worked, a truth that no one in that courtroom could deny anymore. The prosecutor was floundering now, trying to grasp at straws. But, he stammered, but there was nothing left to say. The truth had already come crashing down on him, and it left him speechless. He had no more cards to play, no more tricks to pull. Jalen didn't need to say another word. He had already won. He had exposed the lies, the manipulation, the inherent racism in the system, and he had done it with nothing but the truth and his unshakable confidence. The system that had tried to swallow him whole had been forced to spit him back out. And as he looked around at the stunned faces in the room, he knew that this was just the beginning. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been wronged by this system. Everyone who had been told that their lives didn't matter. Judge Grayson cleared his throat and spoke, his voice shaky, as though he wasn't quite sure how to proceed. "We'll verify the GPS data," he said, though his tone lacked any of the usual authority. The judge had realized that the game had changed, and that this wasn't a simple case anymore. "Sure, go ahead," Jalen said with a knowing smile. "You know the truth now. You can either deal with it or keep pretending." He wasn't just talking to the judge. He was talking to everyone in the room. Jalen stood up and began walking toward the door. As he passed the prosecutor, who still had his mouth hanging open in shock, he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His victory was already clear. As the courtroom doors closed behind him, Jalen took a deep breath. His heart was pounding, not with fear, but with a sense of liberation. It wasn't just about winning this case. It was about something bigger. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his freedom, and most importantly, his voice. The battle for justice was far from over. But for the first time, Jalen knew he wasn't alone. He had sparked something in that courtroom, and no matter what happened next, he had made sure that the truth would not be silenced.